Hello and welcome to Showband Heroes, where we get to meet the men and women who created the most successful live music era in Irish history and who entertained us throughout the 60s and 70s and kept us dancing with each other, even during our darker days. My guest today is Pat McCrossan. You're very welcome, Pat. It's great to see you.
And you too, Stephen.
You know, when I think back on one of the most important and also the most influential programs that we had on RTÉ when I was growing up, when the showband boom started to happen, there was two programs. One was called the Showband Show, and the other was called Picking the Pops. And you featured on both of those, and you stood out because you used a twin neck guitar. Can you tell me a little bit about that, Pat?
Well, it was the idea of it was the first was a gimmick. I built it, and I started actually building it in 1959. And it was after I saw a guy, Larry Collins was his name, an American singer, Larry Collins, with a Mosrite guitar that had a 6-string neck and a mandolin neck. Now, at the time that I was building it, I was experimenting with open tuning, like an open G tuning, so I could use a bottleneck for a slide because I was listening to old blues tunes at that time. So I was able to tune one neck regular guitar for playing the country and the rock and roll, and then I had the other neck tune in the open G tuning, which I could play with a slide. It was the gimmick at the time was that, but then what happened was when I developed the thing, I actually had to suss out electronic parts for it, and I was able to get them through Vox in Italy. I can't remember their name. Vox weren't called Vox in Italy, but they sold the parts. And then, I got a block of wood, a block of mahogany, and there wasn't a block of wood wide enough to make the body. So a guy in the Keys' lumber yard in Derry, a guy called Stanley McCook, who was a steel guitar player at the time, which we never seen many steel guitar players in Ireland in the late 50s. He was able to take the two pieces of wood and meld them together. And that's still holding up today. So it started out as a gimmick. And then when I got a little write-up in the Derry Journal and a couple of other papers, the next thing was I had auditioned for RTÉ and was accepted as a resident band on Picking the Pops. And the guy that introduced that, I don't know if you remember, but you brought his name to mind the last time we talked, was a guy called Dermot Walsh. Do you remember that name?
No, I don't. I remember Paul. I remember Paul Keogh was on the Showband show. I don't remember Dermot.
Dermot Walsh was the host of that show, and the producer was Adrian Cronin.
Or I certainly remember Adrian Cronin. He was he went on to produce a lot of different programs. And
the big thing at the time when we got the gig on the TV was Dave O'Leary had written a letter about the music because he wanted to contact RTÉ. Remember, was fairly new in 1964. We didn't even get it up north in Derry or Donegal, but Dave O'Leary had written a letter about the content of the music. They say he wanted a traditional music, but the group that was on there before us was the Jim Doherty Trio, and they were a jazz trio. So I guess Cronin had the idea, well, let's put a pop group on rather than a jazz group. But I had a copy, an old Xerox copy, and it was a blue copy of that letter for years and years, but it's long since been lost, I still have some of the actual contracts for the performances, but they survive, but some of them, so much stuff gets lost over the years,
So this was really the just after the birth of the showbands, when they were finding their feet and they were getting their own TV programs. Yeah. That must have been a huge boost to the bands playing around the country to get an appearance on that show.
Well, of course it was, yeah, and they had I remember Lonnie Donegan being on there, and there was an American artist one time called Big D Irvin, not sure. Van Morrison and them were on, but they weren't allowed to play for some reason, I think they were scruffy dressed or something. You know, dress then was you wore suits.
Sure.
And you looked nice. And Van and the boys come in, Big Jim Armstrong and Van, I can remember all the guys in the band, and they were real put out that they weren't allowed to perform. So they ended up sitting critiquing a recording of somebody. Lonnie Donegan was great fun when he was on, because he so much energy. Carol Denver Trio, you remember them?
I do. I remember you mentioned Big D Irwin, just in case people may not remember. They had a hit with a record called "Would You Like to Swing on a Star?" I think it was.
Would you like to swing on a star?
That was it.
Jerry Moonbeam, Home in a Jar.
I think it was from an old Bing Crosby movie, "Going My Way," or one of those type movies. But you were unique in a number of different ways. You were called the Checkers. Is that right?
That was the group. Yeah, it was a 4-piece group that morphed from the Magnificent Seven.
So you had the Magnificent Seven came first, but the band that got the gig for the Picking the Pops on RTÉ was the Checkers, wasn't it?
That was the Checkers, yeah.
And you played instrumentals, even though you did have vocalists. You played all instrumentals.
It was all instrumental. I don't know the reason for it being all instrumental, because we had a good singer, rock and roll singer, you know. But they just wanted instrumental, and it may have been something to do with performing rights, or who knows. But we opened the show and closed the show. And of course, you know, besides the guests, the show bands were all on there as well. I couldn't remember the name of all the show bands, but most of them did a performance on that Picking the Pops. It lasted for 13 weeks.
Right. Yeah. And it was a panel show, wasn't it? As opposed to the Showband show, which was just featuring the bands. This was, as you said, critique. They were talking about and saying something was a hit and something was a miss. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's what it was.
And I think the two Hand brothers, were they on it? Jim and Michael Hand?
Well, it sounds familiar, but, you know, again, it's maybe lost to memory.
Yeah, they went on to manage other bands. But you just mentioned there that before you were chosen for that particular show, you had the band, the Magnificent Seven. How did that come about?
It was basically the first big band that I played with, the Magnificent Seven. I had got asked to join a little band in Derry called the Coronets show band, and the Coronets, the leader of the band, kind of called the shots. And I'm sure you remember these conversations. He's the leader. He's getting more money than us. I want a co-op band. So there was whispering and gnashing of teeth that went on in the back of the wagon. And out of that, we got rid of him. Basically, we left the leader of the band and formed the Magnificent Seven based on the movie of the same name. And of course, there was 8 of us in the band. And as I said before, when somebody would ask you, why do you call yourselves Magnificent Seven when there's 8 of you? The stock answer was always, one's not magnificent. Johnny Patterson was the singer, trombone player. Jim McDermott and John Deacon were 2 sax players. Willie Lindsay was the trumpet player. Jimmy Liddy was the front man and MC. Ollie Logue was the drums. Richard Duffy was on bass. And me, and I think that makes 8. We didn't all go by our own names.
Did you?
You have to remember we were all on the dole in Derry. So Johnny Patterson, Richard Duffy, I believe, was called Ricky Stevens.
Lovely.
If I could remember the name. And Pete Lindsay instead of Willie Lindsay. And I had dropped the Mac. I was Pat McCrossan. So we had done that because, you know, the things the way they were then, you know, one week you had work, the next week you didn't. So you had to stay on the dole.
When you were calling out the list of names there, I mean, just strikes you that a big brass section, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, John Deacon and Jim McDermott weren't in the band at the same time. Started with John Deacon, and John went to New York. He's now living in Canada and still playing great jazz in Canada. And then Jim McDermott, who's still playing great jazz around Derry, took John's place. So the lineup was trumpet, trombone, and tenor for the brass.
That was the classic Showband brass lineup, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was, yeah. And then, of course, the jazz influence from the guys that played the horns. Them guys that played horns, they weren't playing Brady Gallagher songs.
No,
they were playing jazz. So there had to be a certain amount of jazz thrown in. And of course, Dixieland got popular in the early 60s too with the English trad bands. So the Dixieland was always a big, great tempo for dancing.
And were they allowed to take long solos in the Dixie numbers?
Well, some of the solos that we had in the Magnificent Seven would have lasted 20 minutes because we were all doing the theatrics. We were jumping about the stage, and I had a 40-foot cord. I was everywhere, on top of the speakers, down among the audience. And, you know, and there was one point I was up on somebody's shoulders and hanging down the back of them with my feet around their neck and me upside down behind them. It was all, it just would just keep going.
What year was that, Pat?
From 59 till about 63, 64 maybe.
So you were putting on a show at that stage.
You know, the first band that I played with after playing with my father's Cayley and Country and Western band, the first band I joined at 15 was a band show. And they did a show. They put on a show on the stage. You know, that's where I saw that happening, where during the break, after playing for a dance, maybe for an hour and a half, then they would have half an hour show. Somebody would dress up in women's gear and do a comedy sketch. Hugh Griffin used to play the bass and climb up on the bass and stand on it when he was playing on, you know, the full-size bass fiddle. You know, so that was the first show that I seen going on. And then, of course, the Magnificent Seven, part of our show was that Jimmy Liddy used to dress up as Margaret Barry.
She used to go around the matches, the GA matches, and singing and playing the banjo. I think she played the banjo.
That's right. She played the 5-string banjo. She played a style called Fralin.
You also play banjo, don't you?
Well, I play 3-finger style, like bluegrass style. I tried the Fralin, but couldn't get the hang of it because it's the opposite of what I'm doing with the 3 fingers, you know. So mine would be described as Scruggs style.
So a G banjo, is it?
It's a G banjo, yeah, 5-string.
But your main instrument has been guitar, has it, all along from day one?
Well, the main instrument would have been the piano, you know, but switched to the guitar in the 1956 or something. You know, the guitar was portable, the piano wasn't portable. And when I would be playing piano with my dad's band, and you'd go to a hall and the piano would be terribly out of tune. And I remember my father one time complaining to the guy about the piano being so bad. And the guy says, "What's wrong with the piano? Sure, I just had it painted."
I mean, there's a great tradition of brass bands and obviously then show bands in Derry. I mean, it punched away above its weight when it came to musicians, didn't it?
Well, a lot of the horn players got their start in marching bands.
Marching bands is like brass bands.
Like brass bands, yeah. You know, and the funny thing about Derry was too, not to get into politics, but a lot of the bands mixed Catholics and Protestants. Because, you know, if the Catholic band was marching and they needed a couple of trumpet players, they weren't adverse to getting a couple of trumpet players from one of the 12th of July bands. And the same with the Protestant bands, if they augmented the bands. Because I have friends that are still alive that played in both bands and the marching season, and you know, because they got their training from the brass band and they felt where they had to pay something back.
So when you listen to the song "The Town I Love So Well," and he speaks about the conditions, the men on the dole played a mother's role, does that resonate with you?
Well, it does. Everything that Coulter wrote there is pretty much how it was at the time.
So tough, and when the music came along, when an opportunity to play music and to earn a living, that must have been a great bonus, was it?
Well, I think it was an accident that we actually made a living from it. There was no official, like today, you know, kids go to college and they get a degree and they move on from there. With us, it was, I think most of it that we made a living, those of it did make a living, I think it was an accident. We didn't have the management to direct us and what to do. That's why so many bands changed men all the time. The bands were great playing together, and they all got all along great. But when something happened, there was no manager, there was no direction there, somebody to tell you, smarten up and do this, stay together, you'll make money. It just was all over the place at that time,
You would have known and perhaps played with the McIntyres, did you?
Well, I don't think I played with any of the McIntyres, but of course I knew them. And then Gay was a marvelous alto player. He just died recently, last year, I think he died. Yeah. There was actually a post on today on Facebook from George Hassan, who's a trumpet player in Derry and played with Gay. And there was a post of Gay playing, and his tone at 90 years of age was totally amazing. The McIntyres were talented, and Paul McIntyre just was at the Jazz Festival this week as well, and he's his son. And what I saw on Facebook was amazing, that they were playing great jazz still in Derry,
And there was Joe McIntyre, the trumpet player.
Joe McIntyre, Josie, the father.
Yeah.
There was a whole bunch of them. There was a lot of McIntyres. Gay used to refer to me as young McCrossan. And the last time I seen him was like 3 years ago when I was over in 2019. And, at that time I was, 78, 77. They were still calling me young McCrossan because my father, that's how they differentiated young Pat and old Pat.
But so the Magnificent Seven happened. Did you split up and form the Checkers? Is that what happened?
Yeah, there was no internal fighting or anything. The Magnificent Seven all got along well. There was no aggro in the band that sometimes can happen, with musicians. Egos are big. If you're going to do this thing at all, you need a big ego. But it was just that the four-piece bands were coming into play. And, the Stones and the Beatles. And I decided, well, I want to try this. Let's do that. And I wanted to work in England. I wanted to work, other than playing Irish halls in London or Birmingham. I wanted to play in English places. So that's when I formed the four-piece and got a manager in, where was it? St. Helens in Lancashire, near Liverpool. And I got a manager over there, and he lined us up with the work in cabaret clubs, working men's clubs, nightclubs, casinos, all kinds of places. So that was a good experience.
So it'd be fair to say that your apprenticeship with the Showbands helped. How would you say it helped? The discipline, or what was it?
Well, with the Showbands, I think with the Showbands give you the gift of the gab. You were able to experience, not just your own band and the crack that went on in your own band, but when you run into other bands like the Capitol or the Freshmen, and we're all sitting together in some cafe in Belfast or someplace, and everybody's running wild and telling stories, and the crack was 90. As Paddy Riley would say, the crack was 90.
And when you think of a lot of the bands, the great bands that came out of Derry, where some of them didn't become household names. I remember one band particularly. I thought they were particularly good. The Emperors. Do you remember them?
The Emperors, yeah. My brother-in-law played in the Emperors. Billy Campbell played with the Emperors. He actually started off playing trumpet with me. And it was his father's band that had the band show, Billy Campbell Band Show. So the M. Dillon and Charlie Dillon on guitars, Tommy McMenamin on drums. God, I can't remember who I was in that band.
I think I remember a bass player. I think his name was Reg. I'm not sure. But it was particularly good, and of course Phil Coulter had a connection with the Showbands as well, didn't he? At that stage,
Phil started a band with Dan Farmer, who's a bass player. They called themselves the Arabs, and I asked Dan one time. I said, "That's a terrible name, the Arabs." He says, "Yeah, ARABS, a rhythm and blues sound." So that's what the initials were.
You were almost like the Les Paul of the north, certainly of Derry. You were not just playing the guitars; you were making the guitars and experimenting with the electronics as well.
Yeah, it was all available stuff, but it wasn't stuff that people actually thought about. You bought a Strat, you bought a Les Paul or whatever, but the sounds, everybody had the same sound, and we're all using a Benson Echo unit. And either a Vox or a Stelmer amp. So I was looking for different sounds, and I found, then it was magazines, and I found from magazines that you could wire your pickups in reverse polarity, reversing the wire, the red and the black, switching them over instead of connecting red to red, connect red to black and reverse them and change the whole tone. There weren't no toggle switches around that would allow you to have 5 or 10 tones on the thing then. So once you switched your guitar, it was done. That was the tone of your guitar,
Was that like putting them out of phase?
That's right.
And strangely, that happened by accident. And sometimes when somebody got a guitar repaired or something, it came back wired wrong. I remember reading that, I think it was Peter Green. Was it Peter Green that used that sound as well?
Well, it became very popular once it was available, and it actually worked best on the Les Pauls.
The result of playing on Picking the Pops, how did that translate into gigs around the country, and where did you play?
Oh, that created a lot of gigs in the south. From us in the north, as I say, it wasn't beaming in. RTÉ wasn't beaming into the north at that time. Or if it was very bad and hard to get, because we all had antennas up on the roof or whatever. But it was very popular from Dublin to Cork. And, we played gigs all the way from Dublin to Cork, every hall. And it actually made us some money at the time.
So, but you weren't just doing instrumentals when you were playing the ballrooms, were you?
No. We had the singers. And again, most of the gigs that the four-piece Checkers would have done wouldn't have been dance gigs. It would have been people standing around the stage to watch, because we had a lot of theatrics in the group at the time. So it was kind of more like a concert, but it was dance. I mean, people danced. You would have maybe 200 or 300 people banged up to the stage, and then at the back of the hall, there'd be people dancing. So it was, you were getting noticed. That was the fun part of it.
Can you remember any of the venues that you played, any of the towns?
Oh yeah, one of the biggest crowds, I think, was the City Hall in Cork. Another favorite place was the Red Barn in Youghal. Yeah. And I'm thinking there was a place, actually, I came on it by accident when I was driving a few years, and it was Inch. in County Kerry. The wife and I were driving around. It was a beautiful summer. What year it was, I'm not sure. It was 2019, maybe it was before that. And I saw this nice beach, and I pulled the car in, and I saw the hall, and I said, "Oh, I played there."
It's sad, isn't it, when you see these halls, some of them still standing, and they're now either derelict or if they've been turned into something else.
Yeah, well, they were thrown up pretty quick. Albert Reynolds. If you remember Albert Reynolds with Lakeland and Roseland and Dreamland. Well, Albert and the brother, when they built them things, they threw them up overnight almost, because they knew how much money could be made with them. And speaking of him, he was one of the best people in Ireland he worked for. He
was, yeah. He always looked after the band. You got a good meal there.
He was a gentleman. Everybody that was in that neighbourhood was sent to the Longford Arms, and you could order whatever you wanted from the menu.
That's right, yeah. Himself and his brother Jim.
Yeah, and there was always beer at the back of the stage.
There you go.
One night we were playing in the Star in Ballyhonus.
Right.
There was a guy called PJ McGarry owned the Star in Ballyhonus, and we were emptied that night by the Capital, who were in Turin, where they saw the devil.
Yeah.
We were finished early in the Star because we were no crowd, and we all headed for Turin to see the Capital. It was kind of on the way home to Derry anyway. But the band was on stage when we get in, so the first thing we did was head up the back of the stage. And when they were doing their show, we were drinking their beer and waving their beer at them, and they were getting... But they were in front of the audience. They were all up around the front of the stage watching the Capital do the show, and we were sitting in the back waving the beer as we drank it out, because we knew there'd be a case of beer there,
Being based in Derry, I mean, the journeys were long, weren't they? It's like being based in Cork. All the journeys are long.
Yeah.
So would you have stayed over in hotels, or did you go home every night?
Most of the time, if you were there for one night, you were on the way back home.
You had to have a good manager who could maybe strategically place you around the place. But if you could pack the City Hall in Cork, it's one of the biggest venues in the country, isn't it?
Well, yeah. And you know, at the time when I had the Checkers, I was being managed by a guy from Dublin called George O'Reilly.
Oh, yes. Famous manager.
A lot of the gigs, I did not know how much money we were being paid. That was being paid to George O'Reilly. And if you had the City Hall packed, you could be sure there was a good fee coming out of that. And then at the night, we'd be handed a $5.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
you know, and if you say, wait a minute, we're getting £20. How much is he getting? We never did find out, but we left him. I left him because I had the suspicion that he was making a lot more money than we were making. Because out of our $5, we were paying for petrol, supporting, you know, paying for the gear and the van and that. So there was no money coming forth, and that's why I left him.
Why did you decide to get out of Ireland?
A number of factors were involved. You know, the Troubles was dangerous. You know, and the fact I had a mixed band and traveling around Derry and County Derry, going over the border. You know, once you were over the border, you were fine. But coming from Donegal back into Derry, 1968, 1969, it was dangerous. So we kind of just give up on it. You know, I gave up on it basically.
And where did you go?
Canada. There was a band in Derry called the Woodchoppers.
Yeah.
And the Woodchoppers went on a tour of New York State, from New York State up to Toronto, Syracuse and different places anyway. But when they got to Toronto, there was a guy called John Gilligan. You may or may not remember John Gilligan. But John Gilligan owned a ballroom in Toronto called the Maple Leaf Ballroom. And the band, the Woodchoppers, were scheduled to perform there. Well, when they got there, Gilligan offered them a full-time job, playing 3 or 4 nights a week. So most of the band emigrated then. They stayed actually there and then and emigrated from Canada to stay in Canada. Some of them went back home. The leader of the band, Willie Bradley, went back home. Pat Halferty, Johnny Patterson, Jim Tolan, Mickey McFadden, they stayed in Canada. And they got some other musicians from Scotland, joined the band, and they formed the Maple Leaf Showband to play a resident gig there. And it was through them they contacted me to come out and play with them, you know.
You joined the band, the resident band in the Maple Leaf, did you?
I joined the band there, yeah. And then, again, I don't know what kind of a head I have. I was getting fed up playing in Irish halls, the Irish crowds, and it was like playing in Toronto to an Irish crowd in the Maple Leaf Ballroom was no different than playing in the Red Barn in Youghal or whatever, you know. So I wanted to get the Canadian audiences, and at the time I got some session work. I was getting introduced to, you know, Canadian acts, and I'm thinking there might be a little more. So the Maple Leaf Show Band became a lounge act called the Shamrocks. You know, so that was the Maple Leaf Show Band would have been the last show band per se that I was in with Derry musicians, you know. And
all of the visiting Irish show bands would have played the Maple Leaf. It was a famous venue.
Oh, they were all out. I remember Murdy Quinn and all those guys. Maybe you were there.
I'm glad to say I'm a bit young for that one. Although, now, funny enough, our drummer, Ray Miller, with the Miami, Ray was in Toronto for quite some time. He played out there. Yeah, certainly did.
But I remember, you know, Gilligan had a house that we stayed in. I mean, I was living there at that time, but Gilligan had a house. He put the bands up, and one of the band, it was hot and humid, you know, as Toronto gets in the summertime. And one of the band decided to sleep out on the porch on an old sofa that was out in the porch. Ended up in the hospital because during the night when he was asleep, got ate alive with mosquitoes. And ended up in the hospital. I'm not sure which of the band that was, but if you might, you know, if you're ever talking to whoever's still alive in the band, they may remember.
Did you get to play with other bands and other audiences then while you were in Toronto, or did you wait until you went to America?
No, I split then from the Shamrocks, and I formed a 4-piece group again called the Blarney Stone. And that was, you know, a mixed band again. And we had a run for about 2 years. And then I decided, you know, we had I was getting TV shows in Buffalo, New York, and one of the guys in the band didn't want to go to the US and didn't show up sometimes for the TV shows, and I decided after incidents like that happened where I wanted to go to Nashville and take my stuff to Nashville, which I did eventually, And one of the sad parts on the Blarney Stone band, there was a guy in the band, Billy Harper, who's still around yet and still playing, and a great singer, good tenor, And when I took the Blarney Stones LP into Nashville, the RCA Records, the first person they locked on was Billy Harper. And I called Billy right away, and I says, Billy, they're interested in you in Nashville. I don't want to work in the States. And to this day, Billy has never worked in the States.
Even though you were trying to get away, so many Irish acts who had come up through the show bands did very well with international audiences. When we think of people like Henry McCullough, obviously would be the big one, who ended up playing with Joe Cocker and Paul McCartney. But Van Morrison and other, they still carry this Irishness with them, don't they? Was that the case with you?
Oh yeah. Well, I basically became, after playing country and rock and roll, and, and I was brought up with Irish music. As I said, my father had a Cayley band, and then added country and bluegrass to it in the late 50s. But I grew up with the traditional Irish music. So I became an Irish musician, even though I wore a cowboy hat and Western gear on the stage and played everything amplified. I became an Irish musician, and that's what I've done from ever since 1970, probably 73 or 74. And that's how I went through the States, through Canada and through the States as an Irish musician. But it wasn't always Irish music.
When you think about it as well, with that kind of background, with Cayley music or traditional Irish music in the background, it does get into all of your playing, whether you're playing rock and roll or jazz. I remember Rory Gallagher saying that to me, that it was a huge part of his sound, the fact that he had this thing, even though he was playing the blues, he had this Irish twiddle in the playing that made him unique. Did you find that as well?
Quite possibly, but to me, I was trying to sound American. I was trying to sound American from the day I turned 15.
But then again, when you consider it again, bringing it all back home, you remember that series was on to, country music and even, I suppose, to a certain extent, country music's influence on rock and roll. A lot of the country music came from Ireland and Scotland, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, there was good selection of music. The Irish guys, the Irish musicians, the singers and the show bands that did the country music did it great, did it well. The problem that I found with, especially in Nashville, was as soon as I opened my mouth to talk.
What, they associated you with Irish music, was it?
Yeah. And I could tell you there was hundreds of agencies that I contacted, and the big stock answer from them was, well, if anything comes up around St. Patrick's Day, we'll call you.
And when you listen to Van Morrison, I mean, he sounds very American, doesn't he? Would you think that's deliberate?
You wouldn't know that Van was Irish at all if you listened to him singing. The only way you can tell is by the lyrics, because a lot of his lyrics are local Belfast. Cleaning the fan light and going down that for 5 Woodbine
and the jam jar.
And the money in the jam jar, yeah.
Yeah. So when did you go to America? When did you decide to settle in America?
1980s, I moved down to Arizona. I mean, I had been up to my backside in snow every winter in Canada, and going to gigs was just terrible sometimes, and you had to do it, But I just decided, and I had played in Arizona and California at some point, and decided, well, I might like it down there. So I got a chance to start a music school in Phoenix, because I had started teaching piano with the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. And they were gung-ho to spread their wings and become the Royal Conservatory of Music all over America as well. They're kind of like Trinity College of Music, where I got my degrees on the piano in Derry, But they made me an offer take him down to Phoenix and open a branch of the Royal Conservatory. Well, when I got to Phoenix and got the work permit and all that, the work permit said, you can open the business, but you can't teach in it. I was on what they call a P3 visa, and a P3 visa was for musicians. And any musician that ever came to America, like even big names like Tom Jones or Engelbert, they would have to have a P3 visa before they could work in Vegas or any of them spots. So it was a musician's visa, and it was good for a year. And you had to be applied for by an agency or theatrical agents in the US. And I came with that, but that didn't allow me to teach music. It allowed me to play gigs, but it didn't allow me to teach music, which would be more like a professional occupation rather than a musician, which would be a part-time occupation. But eventually I got a green card.
And do you teach now?
I don't. I retired from that about 5 or 6 years ago. And I think you saw a post that I had on Facebook where some of the old students that I had are creeping up on my age, and they're still around every Wednesday. We get together.
I saw that, yeah.
And it's all about Irish music. We all play Irish music. But, I'm the only Irish person in the group.
And here they were playing their banjos and playing all of the instruments and really enjoying it. So you must have... Again, it comes out in you, doesn't it? You're going back to your roots.
Yeah, it's full circle.
Full circle.
And when I listened to Gabe Razzle's version of, what was it? The Eavesdropper, which is an Irish jig. Yeah. I play it too, same way. And when I listened to him, I thought, well, wherever he's at, he's on the same wavelength as me, because on his CD that you sent me, there were quite a number of tunes on there that I play as well.
It's a fabulous album, and I know you were one of the pioneers of playing jigs and reeds on the guitar as well. Because I remember
I get in trouble for that, because and I got the first electric in 1957. Yeah, 1957, I believe it was. Yeah, I was 15. I got the first electric, and my dad had a show on BBC, and it was introducing the new cultist group that formed in Donegal, in where was it? In Buncrana, I think it was, in Donegal. And on that show, we had Maeve Mulvaney. You remember Maeve, married Butch Moore?
I do indeed, yes. Maeve
Mulvaney was on it, and Sean Maguire, a great traditional fiddle player from Cavan.
Yeah.
And my father, and the guy who produced that was Maurice Leach, who worked for the BBC in Belfast. But he took us all down there to have this cultist group introduced on this radio show. Of course, I showed up with the electric guitar and the amp. And I was boldly told to leave by cultists, because that was not a traditional instrument once it was plugged into an amp. And Maurice Leach told them to just forget about it. He's staying. If you're not happy with it, then you leave. And a bunch of the cultists left. Now, Maguire played, and Maeve Mulvaney sung. Kevin Mitchell was a traditional singer from Derry. He sang on it. My father actually played bluegrass tunes on it, on the show. Flop-eared Mule was one, and Little Home in West Virginia were two of his party pieces on the fiddle, and he played that. But I have that, being told to get out of cultists for playing Irish music on electric guitar, 1957.
And you have a connection. I mentioned when we spoke before, one of the standout tunes for me from the Showbands instrumentals was Barney Skillen playing the March Hare. And when I mentioned Barney Skillen from the Clippers as being a fabulous guitarist, and obviously player similar to yourself, you were very quick. You came in and you said, but there was another guitar player. And even before you said it, I knew who you were going to mention, Billy McFadden, because Barney actually said, I remember saying to Barney, you know, we were only kids, Gabe Razzle, myself and Dave Prim, and we were, you know, telling him about telling Barney how much we enjoyed his playing, and he said, "Well, if you enjoy me, you should hear Billy McFadden." So he was the original guitar player with the Clippers, wasn't he?
I don't remember him with the Clippers. I do remember him with Dave Glover.
All right. I think the guitar player that was with him that I remember was a man called Jim Gunner.
Gunner, yeah. God, there's another name I haven't heard in years. You're a wealth of knowledge, boy.
Well, I mean, these guys. I was only a kid, so they weren't even allowed into the dance halls. We were so young, but we used to sit down outside and listen to the bands and just fascinated by them because the amount of talent that were in the Irish show bands at the time, and it was just world class. It's very sad that we don't have recordings of these guys.
Yeah, it is, but it just wasn't available then, you know. But we were talking about how talented the people in the show bands were, and we could go on, we could name them from now to doomsday, all the great players, whether they were saxophone players or bass players or guitar players.
When I spoke to Jim Hart, the original singer with the Miami, we were talking about the fact that expediency and saving money in the studio was one of the reasons that we don't have a recorded legacy from the show bands, because it was in quickly and out quickly. So they would hire this little group of session people. The management wouldn't spend the money to go into the studios and hire somebody like Noel Keelan and people like that, Johnny Wadham and people like that. So all the bands sounded the same and sounded bland. It's a terrible pity that the bands weren't allowed and given the time and maybe to express themselves. We would have had a much more dynamic and more varied record legacy, wouldn't we?
The studios then were basically the TV stations or the radio stations. I mean, there were no individual studios. I mean, that guy, Tony Johnson in County Derry, was one of the first that I knew. There was a guy on his own with a little recording studio, you know.
And I mean, that was part-time for him because he was a teacher, wasn't he?
Oh, he was a teacher. Tony was a teacher, yeah.
It's a great legacy. I mean, it had more influence. It's a bit like dark matter, I suppose. You know it was there. It had to be there to produce the type of apprenticeship and the type of effect that it caused right around the world with these great players who came out of it. When you consider even people like that you wouldn't expect to have played with show bands, people like Eric Bell from Thin Lizzy had been with the Dreams show band, and you can name them. I often say Rory Gallagher with the Impact show band and the Fontana show band. It was a great place to, as I say, to learn your chops, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I credit all or most of my learning to the jazzmen in the band.
Who had joined show bands, is that right? Who had joined the show bands?
The jazzmen had joined the show bands.
It was strange that with the parallel that was happening, the show bands and the Irish music scene started to blossom around the same time as what we call perhaps the 60s, the Liverpool sound in England, and which spread obviously all over the UK. But the Irish scene always seemed to have a brass section, whereas the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and the Animals, they didn't. Why was that?
Well, I think it might have been just a unique thing for the Irish bands. But to remember too that the Irish bands, a lot of the show bands were modelled on the American bands. When you saw James Brown, I remember when Ray Charles had the hit with "What Did I Say?"
Yeah.
And came over to play in England. People were amazed to see like 14 or 15 musicians on the stage. And I think that's where the Irish bands got their influence from, because of the bands, the American bands, but had the horn sections, especially the black ones. The black bands always had great rhythm sections and horn sections. And I think that's kind of what that was different. You have to remember, we probably saw more of them and heard more of them in Ireland than they did in England. American music was not played very much in England. It wasn't until Radio Luxembourg and Radio Caroline and that came out, that the pirate stations started coming out, that English people got to hear American artists because it was all subdued.
When you consider the great soul sound, the Stax sound, and all of these, even even the Tamla stuff. Yeah, we were influenced by that. You reckon that was the influence, that huge influence on the Irish musicians? Yes.
Yeah, I would say so. That'd be my guess anyway.
And what a wonderful sound it was. I mean, there was nothing to compare with a show band in full flight when if you went into, whether it was a marquee or a dance hall, just to hear these top bands like the Capitol or the Miami or the Royal or any of those bands. It was just pure magic, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was full of energy, lots of energy, lots of young blood and young energy.
And these guys could arrive in one small van, a Commer van at times, then maybe later on with a transit, and put 2,500 people into a marquee in the middle of nowhere. What was the attraction, do you think? What was it?
I think it was the fact that we were all young, good looking, dressed to kill, and we attracted a lot of the females. So, and then where the women go, the men will follow.
True. Well, we like to think that anyway.
Oh, I think so. I think you have to remember too, that a whole lot of the bands that were out there and playing, and I won't say any names, but some of them were bloody awful. You know, we take all the good ones that were out there, and, you know, not to take anything away from the ones that were not so good. I still give them credit for being out there and trying and playing and learning, because I think I probably started off that way myself, where I was bloody awful. And when I'd be playing, my father would be playing his fiddle, and if I made a mistake or went off the beat, he could lick that bow in the back of my head and not even miss a note. Say, keep the beat, you. Yeah. You know? So, you know, I give it credit to all of them, everybody that went out on the road and, I mean, took your life in your hands, as you well know, sometimes with weather. I remember times that it was so flooded, the roads, that we were pushing the van, and we're up to our knees in water, pushing the van through flooding roads and snow, ice, black ice coming home. God, it was a hard job, but, you know, credit to everybody that had anything to do with it. And except the managers who took all the bloody money.
Isn't it great to be able to say that the bands you played in from day one, up until the time you left the country, and even when you played abroad, that religion or politics never came into these things?
Never did. And I mean, the slagging went on in the van, the slagging went on between each other, but there was never no bad feeling or anything. You know, I always had mixed bands, even in Canada, mixed bands, mixed musicians, and all these people that come to the session here every Wednesday. I couldn't tell you what religion they are. I mean, you could maybe go by their names, that they might be Jewish, or they might, who knows, but it's not an issue. It became an issue in Ireland, and that was the sad part of it, that when that happened, it was dangerous coming home at night at 2 or 3 in the morning, you know.
And the fact that there was no discrimination of any kind made the bands all the richer, didn't it? It made the bands all the better, that you could draw on both communities. So you had the best of the best. Yeah.
I always said that when you went to a dance, and whether it was in County Down or County Dublin, and that hall was packed, you couldn't look down there and say, there's 70 Protestants in that crowd, or there's 50 Catholics in that. You couldn't say that. Nobody knew that. Everybody was out dancing. They were all mad for dancing. I remember all kinds of people going to the dances, and going to Catholic halls, going to Protestant halls. I remember playing God Save the Queen in halls in Donegal. There were orange halls that when I would come home and say, that place we were in the night was an orange hall, we had to play the Queen. And, you know, the first time you're caught out, there's not a tune we learned much in Derry, but when you went to a gig and all of a sudden, then you found out, thank God the horn players know it, you know, or somebody in the band would know it. But there was no aggro, no animosity. I think it was great.
Did you tell me you played 2 anthems in one venue?
Yeah, that's happened too. Played 2 anthems. In fact, some of the venues that I've played since come over here, I've had to play 3 anthems: Irish, Canadian, and American. And you always finish with the one where you are. If you're in Canada and you have to play the Irish one and the American one, you finish with the one of that country. So you'd finish with "O Canada" if you're in Canada, or the Star Spangled Banner if you were in the States. And a lot of the Irish halls here, And I remember getting in trouble in California one time about playing the soldier song. And of course, I knew it in English. I didn't know it in Irish. I knew it in English. And I get into trouble for that because the crowd in the hall was a little Irish club in Los Angeles. And they were getting a little sing it in Irish. I didn't know it in Irish. And there was a guy, an accordion player called Kevin Burke. You know, if you ever know that name, yeah. He got up. He was in the crowd that night, and he got up and sang it in Irish. Saved my bacon.
Saved your bacon. But you're well established now in Phoenix, in Arizona, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm basically retired, though. You know, I just still do gigs. I have the odd one coming up now and again, but I don't. You know, I just got a call yesterday for a gig in October. They were looking to do it in June, asking me to put on a country and western show in June. But I'm not in Arizona in June. I'll be in Canada in June.
I hope Mary Moriarty is looking after you well with the gigs.
Well, Mary, one of the best people.
And I look forward to going out there. I loved it. I was there in October, and it was like hotter than anything I'd ever experienced in Ireland.
This weekend, they say Friday, it'll be 101.
My God.
On Friday, but I'm heading over to San Diego, over to the beach for a few days. I only spend the winter months here. I go up to Canada. We got a little mobile home on the Canadian side of Lake Erie, about half an hour from Niagara Falls, and it's out in the country. So phone and internet is intermittent, if you can even get it, you know. Yeah. But it's a small place right on the lake, and usually moist and cool. So we'll go up there in June and stay there till the end of September, October. Once the temperature stops dropping below 60, we're out of there and headed for the desert, where we get here in October, it'll be 80 or 90.
Yeah, so you have the best of both worlds.
The reasons I'm able to do that was because of joining the union, being in the Irish union, the English union, Equity, the Canadian Musicians Union, the Americans Musicians Union, and all give me a little pension. Because, you know, you pay your dues and you go through your union for your contract, and they're a little pension. Some of them, it's not much. One's $26 and others $116. All those little pensions are nice to have, you know, because I know a lot of musicians never even thought about it, joining the union and paying into it so they could get that little pension when they reach 65, you know.
There was a musicians union here, and it was very strong, but now it seems to have to just represent people say like in RTÉ and things like they're part of the bigger union. I think it's the ITGWU or something like that. But yeah, I agree. It's a terrible pity that there isn't a strong musicians union here.
Dublin used to have a union. What's the name?
That was the Irish Musicians Union. Petered out because people weren't paying their dues. I mean, that was the bottom line. I know that guys
back then was only a penny.
Yeah, it was. And I know people who played on the continent, people especially in places like Switzerland and that, and the union was very strong and it protected them and it made sure that they got well paid, and so it's a pity. But then again, the whole music industry here just went to the wall at the end of the 70s, start of the 80s. There was nothing left.
Yeah,
discos took over and that type of thing. So.
Well, that too. But the one thing that you know I learned much later was that very few of us were doing original music.
Yeah,
we were all doing covers, and every time we did a cover and performed a cover, so to speak, the person that wrote the song or performed the song that we were copying, that we were covering, was getting a few pennies. We never wrote our own music. And that's the thing I learned much, much later, because I started writing music and a lot of stuff that's got published, got some royalties here and there, not big, huge amounts. But if we had all got into that right from the get-go, if everybody was in a show band had decided to say, well, look, let's do, Rock Around the Clock or whatever, but let's throw one of your originals in there.
Yeah.
And there was only a few boys that were doing original music then, but it was many years, 30, 40 years later before I realized that would have been the way to go.
The sad thing about that is there was no incentive. In fact, it wasn't just no incentive. You were actively prohibited from bringing original music into the ballroom, into the set, because we often talk about McDonald's music, instant gratification. People wanted to come in and because it was dance, everything was geared towards dancing. They wanted songs they knew that they were hearing on the radio, and so
exactly.
No, I think one of the first show bands that I can remember that were doing original material was actually Joe Dolan's band, the Drifters, because Tommy Swarbrick was writing songs back in the 60s.
That's right. I remember the brothers. I remember the two of them putting some original songs together. Yeah.
Well, Tommy was actually writing them when he was playing trumpet with Joe Dolan.
But the way the publishing companies handled that too, when you wrote them songs, I mean, you talk to Van Morrison, Van will tell you he doesn't get 1 penny from Brown Eyed Girl.
Does he not?
When he wrote that, he did the same thing that I did with the instrumental tune that I'll eventually, hopefully, remember. He sold it to somebody else. He got paid for doing that. I don't know, maybe he got a $5. From my recollection, I got a $5. Maybe Van got a $5, maybe he got £50, who knows? But he relinquished all rights to that. And they were doing that back then. And he'll tell you himself, he never got a penny. And to this day, doesn't get a penny for Brown Eyed Girl. And you can imagine how much money that's making.
Absolutely, but that's outlawed now. You can't actually give away more than 50% of your writing now. I think that's the law. So you're protected. But then, of course, there's a lot of some of the pirate stations weren't paying any royalties anyway. So it was sort of academic.
Well, that's with the TV show I had in Canada for 3 years, 2 years, 86 to 88. Did one in 89. Eventually, I used to have guests on. Everybody that was doing. There were some original stuff, but the TV station was contacted by Performing Rights, asking for them to join the Performing Rights Society, and the TV station didn't want to, and that ended our shows because we were doing, covers of Chuck Berry or whoever, on the shows, and that ended the show there.
Well, I know in the Miami when I joined, we were doing considerable amount of our set were original songs written by Fran O'Toole and Des. So we had broken ground. But the great thing about that was, especially if you made a record, and if you recorded these songs and you were lucky enough to do it, it got some radio play and it became familiar. The people became familiar with it. So, but right back at the very beginning of the show band, or at the beginning of when you were breaking into the ballrooms and putting on the show, bands weren't really recording that much, were they?
No, it was just wasn't done. I remember the Woodchoppers did a recording. I think it was done in Dublin. I can't really remember, but they did a 45, 2 sides, but no airplay. And then the radio stations were reluctant to play your music anyway.
A very good thing happened during the 60s. I remember there was sponsored programs on RTÉ, on Radio Awareness, as it was called then. So showbands would actually have their own, I think Associated Ballrooms had their own radio shows, 15-minute shows, and they were able to play their own material, play the material. So it's amazing that they didn't realize that when you consider a band like the Royal Showband, perhaps the biggest single ever recorded in Ireland, the Hucklebuck, how well that did for the band and how many people it put into the halls. So you'd imagine that they would have copped on and said, we need to be recording here.
Yeah, well, the other things that the bands didn't do, and then this again, this comes later. This comes up to the present time. When you're performing original songs, if you're on a paid gig, let's say I was playing here in the park where I live for a block party, and I decide to do my own songs, I log them songs and send that log to the performing rights, which I'm a member of SOCAN, which is Canadian version of ASCAP in America. I log those songs and send them in. And, you know, if you're playing one night a month, you know, there's 12 logins. And if you get 5.5 cents a song or whatever the current rate is, but you have to log those songs. You play in a bar and do your own songs, you have to log it and send that log in. That's the way you get paid. But who's doing that?
Yeah, they're not.
You know, I mean, your guys that wrote their own songs, you've been out and played them in front of thousands of people in many venues. Did anybody log those and send them to the performing right? Did they even copyright them? Did Fran and the guys, did they even copyright the songs?
Yeah, they had a publisher. I think it was Phil Solomon, somebody like that. But and they would have been members, as I am, member of the PRS, or PRS for Music, the Performing Rights Society here, and then there's the Irish one called IMRO, which
I'm not familiar with them. IMRO,
and they collect the, and then there's a lot of people when they put their records up on YouTube or put their things up, they do it through CD Baby. So a lot of people, and they would be collecting royalties for them on their behalf as well. So people have become that little bit more savvy when it comes to. But you're right. Yeah. There must have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds wasted.
It was a big industry that was there. It was there for the taking. You know, but who thought about it then?
Pat McCrossan, it's been an absolute privilege and an education to talk to you, and you're a credit to Irish musicians all over the world that you've taken your experience from back in your very youngest days in the Cayley and country bands with your dad, right the way through the showband era and abroad, and with all of the amount of entertainment that you've brought to people in Ireland and the UK and Canada and in America. Long may it last, and long may you continue to show us how it's done. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and thanks for taking the time out.